The Federalist Papers, number 65, Friday, March 7th, 1788, Hamilton. To the people of the state of New York. The remaining powers which the plan of the convention allots to the Senate in a distinct capacity are comprised in their participation with the executive in the appointment to offices and in their judicial character as a court for the trial of impeachments. As in the business of appointments, the executive will be the principal agent. The provisions relating to it will most properly be discussed in the examination of that department. We will, therefore, conclude this head with a view of the judicial character of the Senate. A well-constituted court for the trial of impeachments is an object not more to be desired than difficult to be obtained in a government wholly elective. The subjects of its jurisdiction are those offenses which proceed from the misconduct of public men, or, in other words, from the abuse or violation of some public trust. They are of a nature which may, with peculiar propriety, be denominated political, as they relate chiefly to injuries done immediately to the society itself. The prosecution of them, for this reason, will seldom fail to agitate the passions of the whole community, and to divide it into parties more or less friendly or inimical to the accused. In many cases, it will connect itself with the pre-existing factions, and will enlist all their animosities, partialities, influence, and interest on one side or the other. And in such cases, there will always be the greatest danger that the decision will be regulated more by the comparative strength of the parties than by the real demonstrations of innocence or guilt. The delicacy and magnitude of a trust which so deeply concerns the political reputation and existence of every man engaged in the administration of public affairs speak for themselves. The difficulty of placing it rightly in a government resting entirely on the basis of periodical elections will as readily be perceived when it considered that the most conspicuous characters in it will, from that circumstance, be too often the leaders or the tools of the most cunning or the most numerous faction, and, on this account, can hardly be expected to possess the requisite neutrality towards those who conduct may be the subject of scrutiny. The convention, it appears, thought the Senate the most fit depository of this important trust. Those who can best discern the intrinsic difficulty of the thing will be least hasty in condemning that opinion, and will be most inclined to allow due weight to the arguments which may be supposed to have produced it. What, it may be asked, is the true spirit of the institution itself? It is not designed as a national method of national inquest into the conduct of public men. If this be the design of it, who can so properly be the inquisitors for the nation as the representatives of the nation themselves? It is not disputed that the power of originating the inquiry, or in other words, of preferring the impeachment, ought to be lodged in the hands of one branch of the legislative body. Will not the reasons which indicate the propriety of this arrangement strongly plead for the admission of the other branch of that body to share of the inquiry? The model from which the idea of this institution has been borrowed pointed out that course to the Convention. In Great Britain, it is the province of the House of Commons to prefer the impeachment and of the House of Lords to decide upon it. Several of the state constitutions have followed the example, as well as the latter as the former, seem to have regarded the practice of impeachments as a bridle in the hands of the legislative body upon the executive servants of the government. Is not this the true light in which it ought to be regarded? Where else than in the Senate could have been found a tribunal sufficiently dignified or sufficiently independent? What other body be likely to feel confidence enough in its own situation to preserve, unawed and uninfluenced, the necessary impartiality between an individual accused and the representatives of the people, his accusers? Could the Supreme Court have been relied upon as answering this description? It is much to be doubted whether the members of that tribunal would at all times be endowed with so intimate a portion of fortitude as would be called for in the execution of so difficult a task. And it is still more to be doubted whether they would possess the degree of credit and authority which might, on certain occasions, be indispensable towards reconciling the people to a decision that should happen to clash with an accusation brought by their immediate representatives. A deficiency in the first would be fatal to the accused. In the last, dangerous to the public tranquility. The hazard in both these respects could only be avoided, if at all, by rendering that tribunal more numerous than would consist with a reasonable attention to economy. The necessity of a numerous court for the trial of impeachments is equally dictated by the nature of the proceeding. This can never be tied down by such strict rules either in the delineation of the offense by the prosecutors or in the construction of it by the judges, as in common cases serve to limit the discretion of courts in favor of personal security. There will be no jury to stand between the judges who are to pronounce the sentence of the law and the party who is to receive or suffer it. The awful discretion which a court of impeachments must necessarily have to doom, to honor, or to infamy the most confidential and the most distinguished characters of the community, forbids the commitment of the trust to a small number of persons. These considerations seem alone sufficient to authorize a conclusion that the Supreme Court would have been an improper substitute for the Senate as a court of impeachments. There remains a further consideration, which will not a little strengthen this conclusion. It is this: the punishment which may be the consequence of conviction upon impeachment is not to terminate the chastisement of the offender. After having been sentenced to a perpetual ostracism from the esteem and confidence and honors and emoluments of his country, he would still be liable to prosecution and punishment in the ordinary course of law. Would it be proper that the persons who have disposed of his fame and his most valuable rights as a citizen in one trial should, in another trial, for the same offense, be also the disposers of his life and his fortune? Would there not be the greatest reasons to apprehend that error in the first sentence, would be the parent of error in the second sentence? That the strong bias of one decision would be apt to overrule the influence of any new lights which might be brought to vary the complexion of another decision? Those who know anything of human nature will not hesitate to answer these questions in the affirmative, and will be at no loss to perceive that by making the same persons judges in both cases, those who might happen to be the subjects of prosecution would, in a great measure, be deprived of the double security intended them by a double trial. The loss of life and estate would often be virtually included in a sentence which, in its terms, imported nothing more than the dismission from a present and disqualification for a future office. It may be said that the intervention of a jury in the second instance would obviate the danger, but juries are frequently influenced by the opinions of judges. They are sometimes induced to find special verdicts, which refer to the main question to the decision of the court. Who would be willing to stake his life and his estate upon the verdict of a jury acting under the auspices of judges who had predetermined his guilt? Would it have been an improvement of the plan to have united the Supreme Court with the Senate in the formation of the Court of Impeachments? This union would certainly have been attended with several advantages. But would they not have been overbalanced by the single disadvantage already stated, arising from the agency of the same judges in the devil prosecution to which the offender would be liable? To a certain extent, the benefits of that union will be obtained from making the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court the President of the Court of Impeachments, as is proposed to be done in the plan of the Convention. While the inconveniences of an entire incorporation of the former into the latter will be substantially avoided. This was perhaps the prudent mean. I forbear to remark upon the additional pretext for clamor against the judiciary, which so considerable an augmentation of its authority would have afforded. Would it have been desirable to have composed the court for the trial of impeachments of persons wholly distinct from the other departments of the government? There are weighty arguments as well against as in favor of such a plan. To some minds, it will not appear a trivial objection that it could tend to increase the complexity of the political machine, and to add a new spring to the government, the utility of which would at best be questionable. But an objection which will not be thought by any unworthy of intention is this: a court formed upon such a plan would either be attended with a heavy expense or might in practice be subject to a variety of casualties and inconveniences. It must either consist of permanent officers stationary at the seat of government and, of course, entitled to fixed and regular stipends, or of certain officers of the state governments to be called upon whenever an impeachment was actually depending. It will not be easy to imagine any third mode materially different, which could rationally be proposed. As the courts, for reasons already given, ought to be numerous, the first scheme will be reprobated by every man who can compare the extent of the public wants with the means of supplying them. The second will be espoused with caution by those who will seriously consider the difficulty of collecting men dispersed over the whole Union. The inquiry to the innocent, from the procrastinated determination of the charges which might be brought against them, the advantage to the guilty from the opportunities which delay would afford to intrigue and corruption, and in some cases to detriment to the state, from the prolonged inaction of men whose firm and faithful execution of their duty might have exposed them to the persecution of an intemperate or designing majority in the House of Representatives. Though this latter supposition may seem harsh and might not likely be often to be verified, yet it ought not be forgotten that the demon of faction will, at certain seasons, extend his scepter over all numerous bodies of men. But the one or the other of substitutes which have been examined, or some other that might be devised, should be thought preferable to the plan in this respect, reported by the convention, it will not follow that the Constitution ought for this reason to be rejected. If mankind were to resolve to agree in no institution of government until every part of it had been adjusted to the most exact standard of perfection, society would soon become a general scene of anarchy and the world a desert. Where is the standard of perfection to be found? Who will undertake to unite the discordant opinions of the whole community in the same judgment of it, and to prevail upon one conceited projector to renounce his infallible criterion for the fallible criterion of his more conceited neighbor? To answer the purpose of the adversaries of the Constitution, they ought to prove not merely that particular provisions in it are not the best which might have been imagined, but that the plan upon the whole is bad and pernicious. Publius. As read by Bradley Bartz on January 31st, 2020. In regard.
Please handle this side up. You got me upside down. Should only feel this much, but in your liquid I drown. I couldn't put it in a letter. I should have put it in a song. I would have put it in forever. Put it in you all night long. So you can't get me wrong. Can't get me wrong. So you can't get me wrong. Can't get me wrong. So you can't get me wrong. Can't get me wrong. Don't put in your stomach. Can't get me wrong. Can't get me wrong. Don't put in your stomach. Don't it look like this is something good? Yeah, I can spread you when you buttered up. This don't do it for you, nothing would. I don't make money off the other stuff. Yeah, I've been thinking about you, thinking about me, thinking about that money. I don't give a motherfuck. You won't ever get one from me. I've been dreaming about you, dreaming about me, dreaming about that dream. Please don't worry about that ring. It won't ever be a thing. So you So you can't get me wrong. Can't get me wrong. Can't get me wrong. Can't get me wrong. So you can't get me wrong. Can't get me wrong.
Don't put in your stomach.
Can't get me wrong. Can't get me wrong.
Don't put in your stomach.
So you can't get me wrong. Can't get me wrong. Can't get me wrong. Can't get me wrong. Yeah. Got that genie in my blood, got that juju on my pin, got that Lucy on my tongue, got that num on my teeth, got that molly in my tongue, got that mushrooms in my teeth. Is you finished? Is you done, bitch? I might be. I just got inside the club. Now I'm fucking with that lean. Got tequila in my cup, got that white girl in my sleeve. She forgot about her blood. She just thought about her freeze. I'm just all about to come. Only real ones in my seat. Only real ones in my. Tell that. Only real ones in my. Killer white. Everybody in the room get down. You're fucking with the real one now.
Killer white.
Everybody in the room get down. You're fucking with the real one now.
Killer white.
Everybody in the room get down. You're fucking with the real one now.
Killer white.
Everybody in the room get down. You're fucking with the real one now.
Killer white.
Yeah. All my healers got the plug, all my dealers got the fee, all my dreamers got the love, all my beaners got it free, all my scene is about to buzz. I'm like Mac Dre with the D, push that snowball as you rolling. I might be. I just came out here to fuck. I've been trying not to cuss, I've been trying not to buzz. Haven't had a lot of luck. I just do it on the side. I just do it all the time. Only like you in the mind. Tell the help I'm doing fine. Tell the help I'm doing fine.
Killer white.
Everybody in the room get down. You're fucking with the real one now.
Killer white.
Everybody in the room get down. You're fucking with the real one now.
Killer white.
Everybody in the room get down. You're fucking with the real one now.
Killer white.
Everybody in the room get down. Beat feeling like a drug, huh? You're a little bump, I can see you like the buzz. I can be a plug, We can have fun going all the way up. I'ma feel young, Yeah, what's in the cup? Beat it like a drum. How you gon' come, If you didn't get the rhythm right, you know you feel it if it isn't late night. Nah, you ain't did it right. Everyone invited, it don't matter how you live in life. Get it right, what you like, get inside, you and me. We can do it live every night.
System I'm broke, but you don't like the radio. Nothing to my flow, keep fucking up your cranium. Rapping in my head, I'ma pass it to my lady next. Feel it in your chest, though. Crazy is a crazy the system I'm broke, but you don't like the radio. Nothing to my flow, keep fucking up your cranium. Rapping in my head, I'ma pass it to my lady next. Feel it in your chest, though. Crazy is a crazy the.
Critic tell me that I'm no good. Doing lines from a notebook. They don't like my joke hooks. Yeah, they don't like my flavor. They don't like the psychedelic vibe from my vapor. Made it in my own land. Fam saying I'm addicted. Thank God I'm a grown man. Giving you them toe taps. Think I died and gone to heaven. Keep looking for my toe tags. Maybe I got no class. Like school on a Saturday. Play it for my dues. I'm cool with the cabinet. Cap it up. Let it age. Putting that away. Salivate. For the aim. Let it calibrate.
System I'm broke, but you don't like the radio. Nothing to my flow, keep fucking up your cranium. Rapping in my head, I'ma pass it to my lady next. Feel it in your chest, though. Crazy is a crazy the system I'm broke, but you don't like the radio. Nothing to my flow, keep fucking up your cranium. Rapping in my head, I'ma pass it to my